policy for volunteer programs. Thank you, Zoom voice. And I just want to share something really quickly in the chat for you, and it's a link that I will share again after as well. This is just where I've kept the where I put the slide PDFs for today, as well as any resources I'm talking about. So I'm just dropping that into the chat now. I'll share it again later, but just wanted to give that to everyone up front so that you have that to come back to later. So I'm going to dive in. So I've already been introduced. Thank you very much, Michelle. Just to give a bit of context for you as well, I've been volunteering for a good chunk of my life and a volunteer manager since 2005, but I've also been an adult educator for more than 10 years as well. And I do also want to say that even though I'm talking about legislation and policy, I'm not a lawyer. Nothing I say is legal advice. If you're uncertain about something, please talk to legal counsel or to anyone in your organization who does have that specific expertise. My goal today is really to give you an overview of how legislation and policy comes together for volunteer programs. And I'm coming to you from Volunteer Toronto. If you don't know who we are Toronto's Volunteer Centre. Our role is all around connecting volunteers in the organizations that need them. My particular role is around training, as Michelle mentioned, and also doing my best to stay up to date on what's happening in the world of volunteer engagement. I basically ran a version of this workshop just about a week ago, and already something has changed since then. So really trying to stay on top of that, and I'll be talking about that today as well. So the very first thing I want to talk about is just a couple definitions, which I think are important in any conversation, but especially so when we're talking about things like policy and legislation and procedures and all that stuff. So first, what is a policy? The policy is a guiding statement which indicates the position of your organization. So it's a value or a belief, or really just a principle, plan, or course of action. And it often will include specific steps, procedures, or methods for an organization to enact those particular principles or plans. For your volunteer program, policies are really in place to guide the organization so that they apply to everybody. And in that way, everyone is then liable for any consequences for not following the policy. So I've talked a little bit about, I used the word course of action, I've used the word procedure already. So what actually is a procedure? The procedure is the how of the policy's what. So it's basically the forms, the templates, the guidelines, or the actual set of actions or activities that should be carried out. So when I'm talking about policies and procedures, they do go together, but there's some distinction as well that I'll dive into. And the link that I've shared provides a bunch of examples you'll see of both policies and procedures. And then another thing I'll be talking about today, and the first thing I'll be diving into is legislation. So those are the laws that govern operations and policies. Now, something I want to say before I continue on is that policies are, and I'm using air quotes here, traditional parts of managing nonprofits. So when an organization is incorporated, so they're a nonprofit or a charity, there are certain policies they're required to have by law. What we're going to talk about is that there's a bit of a challenging gray area for how volunteers are included. The best practice is that volunteers are included in every policy, period. But there's certain places where this doesn't make sense. And there's also places where having a policy also doesn't make sense. Your policies don't need to be these long multi-page documents. They can be simple statements, but sometimes it's important to still have something like that written down. That's sort of what I'm trying to say here. So one of the first things I want to mention is the legal definition of volunteer in Ontario law. So up until basically last year, it's been a bit of a mixed bag in terms of what the definition of volunteer was in Ontario law. And in almost every case that it's come up in the past, it's usually been connected to occupational health and safety. So as an example, in 2014, an amendment to that act introduced this definition as an expanded definition of the word worker, using those air quotes again. So that means a secondary school student in a co-op program, a college, university, or post-secondary institution approved programs like an internship or a placement. And then this is a very legally way of writing this, such other persons as may be prescribed who perform work or supply services for no monetary compensation. And this was written this way to essentially extend as much of your organization's protections to volunteers if you define volunteers as any of these terms, because that means that they are workers. It's complicated. To make life easier, we did get a new definition last year, and this is the first formal detailed definition of volunteer within Ontario law that came from the Support People and Businesses Act in 2021. It states, volunteer means a person who performs a service, but who receives no compensation for doing so, other than an allowance for expenses or an honorarium, and excludes a person receiving some other form of credit, such as academic credit, or fulfilling a sentence requirement. Again, it's a little long and wordy. I'm not going to go into this too much, but it's helpful to know that the term volunteer is now within and protected by Ontario law in certain areas. And where this was relevant is around police checks, which I will get to. But to get us started, I wanted to do a very small activity. We are a really big group, so it's going to be entirely through Zoom poll or Zoom chat. But the first thing, anyone who wants to share in the chat, name a volunteer specific policy your organization has. And I'll start off with that. I'll write it in the chat for everyone. We have a volunteer dismissal policy, so that is unique to our volunteers. So just give a moment if anyone wants to share a volunteer specific policy that your organization has in the chat. So seeing strike policy, screening policy, immunization policy, someone sharing just volunteer policy, pretty common, recognition policy, volunteer management policy, and it goes on and on. Thank you everyone for providing these. If you're in the middle of typing, feel free to continue and share that there's quite a range of the types of policies we'll have, and that also some organizations will have just a policy, singular policy for the volunteer program. So to kind of expand on this a little bit, I am going to launch a poll for us, and it's going to have 3 questions. So if you give me just a moment. All right, so I've launched the poll, and you're going to see these questions that you can go through. The first 2 are really an exercise to see what kind of policy you think would help you determine the scenario. So in the first case, if you need a police check. In the second case, if you how long you can keep the volunteer's information. And then the last question is a bit more of a an interesting thing that we will reveal in the next slide around which of the laws listed directly relate to volunteers. So I'll give everyone a moment to go through those questions. And if the poll is not popping up, you should see the poll button at the bottom of your screen. Usually it's beside participants, and you'll be able to see it allowed to pop up there. Give it another 20 seconds or so for the last responses to come in. All right, so let's take a look at what everybody had to say here. So for the first question, which policy could help you determine if a volunteer needs a police check? The majority said screening, some folks said recruitment, and a couple picked the other ones. That answer is actually up to you. It's up to your organization about how you would, where you would put that kind of conversation into your policies. In ours, it is part of our screening policy. For that question number 2, around how long to keep information, most people picked privacy, a couple picked dismissal, and then again, a couple picked other ones. Ours would also fall under privacy. You might put it under dismissal based on how long you want to keep specifically information around volunteers who have been dismissed. That's an important thing for us. We do keep it longer in case there's turnover and a volunteer who has been dismissed wants to come back. And then the last piece, which of these directly relate to volunteers? So I'm going to show you the answers in just a moment. Broadly speaking, directly relating to volunteers is the Occupational Health and Safety Act, the privacy legislation, the Ontario Human Rights Code, and accessibility for Ontarians with disabilities. The other two, Criminal Records Act actually has to do with how criminal records are structured. It doesn't have to do with the police check process. And then of course, the Employment Standards Act, which I'll talk about shortly, doesn't include volunteers at all. So thank you for bearing with me with that. All right, so I used to talk about 5 laws that connect with volunteer management. I'm going to talk about 7 laws, but again, they're not all direct, and the reasons for that will become quickly quite clear. So first, the Employment Standards Act is really about best practices. It's not specific to what volunteers need to do, but all the rest of them do have some more specific connections. So I'll talk about privacy law, I'll talk about the Human Rights Code, health and safety legislation, our accessibility law, record check reforms, which I have a very specific update for today, incidentally, and also COVID-19 emergency rules and bylaws that are constantly changing and in flux. So let's start with the Employment Standards Act. The purpose of this act is to ensure safe working conditions for all workers in Ontario. According to this act, a worker is a person who performs work or supplies services for wages. So what's important to remember here is that volunteers are not eligible for rights and protections. Now, in that example I gave earlier about some different things like co-op placements or post-secondary learning opportunities, there may be some crossover, but the Employment Standards Act, and in particular the Ministry of Labor, are very, very specific about which of those types of roles are eligible for protections. So what's a good idea is basically to follow the practices you have for your human resources following the Employment Standards Act and apply those to your volunteers. So things like how people can take time off, what hours of work should be, what breaks look like, what does a leave of absence or termination look like. So again, it's not directly connected. You do not need to comply with the ESA for your volunteer program, but you should take the good ideas from it and apply that to your volunteer program. We're going to cover a lot, so I'm moving right quickly along, but if you do have questions, please drop them into the chat as we go, and I'll do my best to answer them as they come or at the end as well. Next is privacy legislation. There's a few laws here. On the federal level, there's the Personal Information and Protection of Electronic Documents Act, which also is called PAVRO or PIPEDA. We'll see what the subtitles try to do with that. Yeah, pay-to or PETA, close enough. That is a federal law that does impact activities of charities and nonprofits, but specific to transactions. So fundraising, sales, third-party vendors, those types of things. For a provincial institution, that will fall under the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, or FIPA, and in the municipalities, that's MFIPA. And then for healthcare settings, it's PHIPA, Personal Health Information Protection Act. The key thing about all of these is around how you collect and what you do with any personal information. So even if, let's say, you don't collect volunteer information to do with fundraising, which is the context of the federal legislation, you might still have some certain crossover that is transactional in some way or another. And I'll explain a little bit more on that. So your policy statement around privacy should be about how you collect and use and protect that information. And then also think about how any funding and support may be tied to expectations about protecting data. If you get any provincial funding, that information related to that funding falls under FIPA, which you may not have realized. So it's a good idea to keep those laws consistent across your organization, across your volunteer program. You also want to avoid any unusual or unexpected consequences of sharing information. You don't want to be that front page story of information getting out. And you also want to be consistent around how you collect, use, and safeguard information. So as an example, maybe during COVID, you collected certain information like immunization or test information. How does that fit in the broad scope of your privacy practices? And one other thing I do want to mention before I move on is making sure that everybody has the ability to access and make changes to their personal information. So if I'm a volunteer for you, I should be able to come to you and say, I need to update my information, or I actually want certain information removed. And that's when you can say, okay, well, the privacy policy says we need X, Y, Z information for this reason. And that's okay. If you need certain things like emergency contact information, it may not be possible for you to allow someone to remove that data because you need it. Trucking right along, next we have the Ontario Human Rights Code. This was adopted in 1962 to ideally protect Ontarians from discrimination in 17 protected grounds. And these grounds could include things, or they do include things like gender identity, race, or record of offenses. I'm not going to go too deep into this because I have a whole part of the PAVRO conference in May to talk about this, so I hope you'll come and join me for that. But really what the code is designed to do is to create an Ontario where people are protected from discrimination and treated equally. But I will also say it is a piece of paper. It's not a body that can go in and enforce this at all times. Now, there are structures to support it, but what that means is that the effort is on you to make sure you're not creating situations where people will be discriminated against in any process of volunteer engagement. For example, you can't say, you can't decide to fire a volunteer because they're not Canadian, and that's the only reason. The other side of the code is helping to help you create diversity, anti-discrimination, and appropriate screening policies and practices. And one important piece of this is something called the bona fide occupational requirement. This is basically a specific reason for a recruitment or screening request or decision. A great example that I love to give, because it's the easiest one, is if someone is going to be alone with a vulnerable client, then you're going to want to ask for a vulnerable sector check. You're going to ask for that personal information because it's going to help you make that decision. But you want to consider other things around your screening policy. When is it appropriate to ask for more information than you need? What does it tell you? What decisions can you make on it? So for example, the Human Rights Code can really help you determine, do you really need someone's mailing address if you're never going to send them anything? And the reason for that is, could where they live somehow even unconsciously impact your decision to choose them to be a volunteer? I'm not saying that's always the case, but these are the kinds of things to think about around the Human Rights Code and around how you will make your decisions in a way that's compliant to this law as well. Next is the Occupational Health and Safety Act in our grand tour of Ontario law. So OHSA is here to create a workplace that is safe and healthy for all. My interpretation and the interpretation of a lot of workplace lawyers is that when a volunteer is in your place of work and they are doing what I will use air quotes again to say work, they need to be protected along the exact same lines as any paid employee. So that needs to be a safe and healthy workplace for everybody. Where things get a little bit uncertain is the context of working from home. I primarily work from home. So when I'm at work during the day at my desk, I am in the workplace. So there are expectations around my health and safety as well. So that's something to think about for your virtual volunteers. Another component of this is that you want to have and need to have policies to avoid and address violence and harassment in the workplace. And in doing so, you want to assess the workplace for risk and provide appropriate training when needed. So both training when someone gets started, but also training when maybe a new risk factor will come up. A big example for a lot of organizations has been in the process of the pandemic, reopening in-person services and providing proper training on social distancing, PPE use, and other things as necessary. So as I've said, health and safety for staff should be as much as possible the same for volunteers. You should have consistent definitions and a consistent risk assessment practice and policy in place. And then, of course, on top of everything else is COVID-19, as I mentioned, whatever your health and safety processes are, even as things continue to open up across the province too. Next, we have the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, which I think by now we're all pretty familiar with. AODA started rolling out more than 10 years ago now with the idea of an accessible province, a fully accessible province in 2025. If you ask me my personal advice, we're not going to reach that deadline. That's in 3 years and we're not there yet. But as organizations, we can do what we can both for our people, but also to comply with the law as well. Number one, as you may already know, is that every volunteer must receive customer service standard training. This is no longer the case where only frontline volunteers need to do this. It has to be everybody. So I often like to point people to Access Forward, which I just shared in the chat, which is free customer service standard training. It's not the best, but it'll do. It does cover everything, although I do recommend organizations having something of their own that also speaks to the people in their communities as well. Your organization should also have some kind of plan in place around facilities, programs, and information access. Everything from multiple formats and changing font sizes on your website to physically having people be able to get into your facility, both volunteers and community members. And then, of course, a consideration for everybody is around accommodating working from home into the future. So the context of what we said we weren't able to do before the pandemic is now something we actually can do, and in some cases quite well. So for those volunteers who may not have been physically able to volunteer in person can do so safely from home, okay, what are those considerations from an accessibility standpoint into the future? And it really all comes down to, how do we treat everyone consistently? How do we make it that we can accommodate volunteers and have a consistent approach in the way we treat our clients, our volunteers, our staff, our community members, everybody? I'm going to take a moment to read this question in the chat. How do we navigate the difference between the Occupational Health and Safety Act and the Support People in Business Act? I'm specifically thinking of the status of placement students. This is a really good question. And the reason for that is that the official definition of volunteers leaves out placement students, but placement students actually falls under a little bit of a different gray area with the actual ESA. So the understanding is that placement students are workers, quote unquote, more so than volunteers have been considered in the past. So in the context of placement students, my recommendation is just align with health and safety rules that you have in place, align with anything from the school that they might have. And then, of course, as I said before, also talk to your legal counsel or talk to the people in your organization that are specifically connected with policies as well. I know this didn't fully answer your question, Deb, but I hope it was a starting point. All right, on to the next thing as we continue this journey is around record check reforms. So one of the things around record check reforms is that we've actually seen the most movement in the last few years. As you probably know, from 2018, we saw a change to 3 levels of police checks, changes to Mental Health Act non-disclosure, meaning that before these changes, certain things on the Mental Health Act would be disclosed, and changes to Youth Criminal Justice Act disclosure, basically meaning the amount of time that something will show on a police record if somebody was charged under the Youth Criminal Justice Act. What that basically means is that if somebody is 3 years older, whatever the judicial system thought of them as youth, because it does actually vary based on the date of the crime committed or whatever, it may not show at all because of the way these disclosures changed. And then the biggest change is around what's called exceptional disclosure guidelines. So a police service can decide to provide more information than they would normally provide on that level of check. It only applies to the vulnerable sector check or the level 3. It's super, super rare is what we've learned from across the province. And the reason for it would be that maybe the vulnerable sector check shows nothing, but this person has become a person of interest for many cases, or there's other things that are relevant that the police service would then decide that providing this information would be a good idea. So it's, like I said, it's unlikely that most people have seen this. Now, the thing I'm excited to share about is that as of tomorrow, level 1 and 2 checks are free in Ontario. This was just announced like hours ago. So I'm just going to share the link for you in the chat that has the news release from the Government of Ontario, in case you haven't seen it or heard it yet. So your local police service is making police checks free as of tomorrow. I will caution that in Toronto, where my work is based, that is in person only. A volunteer will need to go in person with a volunteer letter, probably for the next week or so. because the Toronto Police needs to update their online system. But check your local police service or OPP, whoever provides police checks for you, they should already have information online today because this starts tomorrow. And this is only level 1 and 2. It does not impact vulnerable sector checks. And I did just see a question. Yes, it is only for volunteers, that these checks are only for volunteers as well. And I'm seeing lots of questions come in. I will get to all those in a moment. The only other change around police checks that is important right now is that as an organization, you are legally able to set your own term of validity on police checks. So what that means is during the pandemic, a lot of organizations decided that the vulnerable sector check, if you got it 6 months ago and you want to volunteer now, it still applies. And now you're legally allowed to do that. Not that you weren't legally allowed before, but what it means is that you as an organization can decide how long a vulnerable sector check or any check is valid, because it is valid from the very day that it is done. So if you ask for someone to renew it every 3 years or whatever that might be, it's entirely up to you. I'm going to go through the questions because a lot have popped up and I want to take a look at them. Okay. So just coming back to the piece around the students, someone shared that where they work, they have a separate policy procedure for unpaid students. That definitely is the case. I understand that National Police Bank CPIC is 2 years behind on loading police charges. I had not heard of that. My understanding from specifically Toronto Police Service and talking to them is that they use their own database, and the national database is as up to date as they can make it. But I'm going to make a note around that to look into it as well. Yes, it is frustrating that it's not the vulnerable sector check. Us and many other organizations, including the ONN, are advocating for vulnerable sector check to be included because most of us use that. But it's also an opportunity to consider, okay, do we need vulnerable sector check for every role? Maybe there's certain roles where we can use a different level of check that might be free as well. And Charmaine shares that every organization has always been allowed to set their terms of how old a police check can be. That's exactly right. It's basically just that it's now written into law. It doesn't really make any difference as well. So I also note, we don't decide if a position should be vulnerable sector, police do. In my work on this, it is who can request a vulnerable sector check is determined by the police. What I'm saying around whether or not a person needs a vulnerable sector check for your role is your risk threshold. So yes, if somebody is alone with a vulnerable client, unsupervised, absolutely that's needed. If it's a group setting, there's staff present, there's all these different things that you need to keep in mind. That's when it becomes your decision. So Melissa just shared, our OPP asks us to decide vulnerable or not. And really at the end of the day, the reasoning for that is making it as accessible to everybody. But in a lot of cases, and I know for a lot of the organizations present today, you definitely do need a vulnerable sector check. That's just how things are. And if you're really not sure about all of this, I hate to promote myself, but I am doing a workshop on this in April. It's a full detailed look at the police reference checks, and that's coming up in April, and you can check that out at volunteertoronto.ca. I did get a question that popped up for me as well around VSSs in Toronto. So Toronto is one of the only regions in the province where you cannot get a vulnerable sector check online. It is a headache for everybody, and we've been told it will be the end of this year, but I was told that 2 years ago. So not going to cross any fingers for myself as well. So I'm just going to catch up on these messages, and then we will continue along from here. All right, so often we will be asked to provide a letter to the volunteer to request a specific check. That is sometimes the case. Charmaine sharing, police boards have the authority to decline a vulnerable sector check. That is also true. Nadine shared, we use an attestation form for longstanding volunteers instead of asking everyone to have a new screen done. That's quite a common practice, and I actually recommend it based on your risk threshold. Again, it's based on your organization's risk process. Allison, in Ottawa, we must provide a justification for the check, and they may decline if they do not think it's needed. And even for an organization that serves vulnerable people on child welfare, yes, police might still decide to decline. Thank you for this. This is very important conversation, and maybe this is a bigger conversation for a future PAVRO webinar as well, to talk a little bit about that structure that is in place in the province. One last thing I want to say about police checks, and then I will definitely have to move on, is that if you use a third-party system like BackCheck or one of the many others, they are not free. And we don't yet know what that process is going to look like yet, but they are not technically, any of them that don't use an Ontario Police Service, Sterling Backcheck does not, they don't have to follow that rule. So it's something to keep in mind in terms of what that might look like. So as Charmaine just shared, they don't have access to all the records. That is also true. And I have some experience as well, specifically with something coming back not clear, and then the volunteer has to go to the police service anyway. So that's basically what that process can sometimes look like. So I am going to continue on to this last piece, which, you know, with each passing day sometimes feels a little bit less relevant, but it's still something to talk about very briefly, in that there are sort of lingering provincial rules, acts, and regulations, municipal rules or bylaws around COVID-19. At varying time, that looks like defining essential services. When we've had stay-at-home orders, leaving the home to volunteer, mask wearing. As we know, mask wearing is both a province-wide piece, but also some municipal bylaws as well. All of these apply to what your rules might look like for volunteers, and that those rules today might look different tomorrow, as we know as well, including even vaccination requirements. So how long does your immunization requirement stay in place? Is it permanent? All of those pieces as well. So I have a Zoom poll for you, and I'm going to pop this up for you now. And this is asking a couple questions. It's going to ask if any of the laws we just talked about are a surprise to you, and if there are any laws missing. And I realize I didn't give an option for no, none of these are a surprise to me. If that's the case, you can choose anything, or you can just not participate in the poll. That's also okay. All right, I'll give another 30 or so seconds for more folks to answer in the poll. And again, you don't have to reply. That's totally fine. All right, so let's take a look. Ashley just asked, the slides will be available after. I missed the beginning portion. Yes, I will share the link for you again. The slides will be available as a PDF at this link. And that is a good reminder for me to share it again. And it'll also be shared again with you after. And this is also being recorded. Okay, so the some surprises, record check reforms for some folks, and the connection with Employment Standards Act. And then the second question, which of course the folks who didn't participate didn't see, and that's totally cool. Laws that are missing. So just to quickly share, the Long-Term Care Home Act only applies, of course, to long-term care homes. It is the only law in the province that requires the existence of a volunteer manager or a volunteer coordinator type person. Child and Family Services Act specifically speaks to any organization that's in child, youth, or family services. So again, even though volunteering isn't specifically in there, it does connect with how we protect people in those programs. The Ontario Not-for-Profit Corporation Act, or ONCA, as you may know, is coming into force. It impacts how your organization is set up if it's a provincial nonprofit, but it doesn't actually impact volunteers. And then anti-spam legislation. Do your best to not spam your volunteers. That's sort of the general rule. Your organization should already have some of those processes in place as well. So now it's time to take a look at policies themselves. So first, to kind of reiterate, I'm going to pull all of these up for you. What are some policies that are a good idea to have? I'm not telling you you need to have them. A privacy and personal information policy, health and safety and violence and harassment prevention. It's a good idea to have a fulsome accessibility policy that either is the same as the one with staff or is really detailed for volunteers. You should have some kind of human rights, anti-discrimination policies, screening policies, and then some general best practice like code of conduct, dismissal, that are obviously not from the Employment Standards Act, but ideas that could be taken from there. And in the link I shared with some examples, you'll see Volunteer Toronto's dismissal policy as an example that you are welcome to steal and use freely. Some other policies that might be helpful for you, but not necessarily a requirement. By any means, recognition and benefits, resignation, so volunteers know that they can leave. A role creation policy around how to actually build the roles. Supervision, orientation and training, some folks already have that. Risk analysis, record keeping, and dress code, which is one that we as an organization actually removed several years ago because we were setting too many restrictions, and what we really wanted to do was just be clear about what the expectations are. And so we looped that more into our other policies and clarified that a little bit. So I have one more poll for you. Thank you for bearing with me because I do love interaction. What do you think are the pieces that are needed for a good policy? And it's just the one question, it's multiple choice. Choose what you think are the pieces that are needed for a good policy. All right, a few more seconds. All right, so almost everyone said clear purpose, and then slightly less for all the rest. So definitions, how is it applied, who is responsible, and what steps to take to enact it. And that's basically true, is that we don't need all of these. So let's take a look at those in a little bit more detail as well. And that is a great question, Rachel. I will get to that shortly. All right, so components of a good policy. So based on that, the purpose is really the goal of the policy to just explain what you're trying to do. And then the policy statement is usually a couple sentences at most of the actual rule or standard. The definitions are really, if you need it, explaining on terms or elaborating on language. Application responsibilities, really, how do you apply it? Who is responsible for what? And procedures themselves, so the actions, guidelines, process, or forms. So I'm going to really quickly bring something up for you, and this is in the folder that I've shared with you. It's a policy template. So this is all of these pieces. Just scrolling through really quickly. Again, you have this in the link I shared. But what I do want to say is you don't need all of these parts. It's not important to have every single part. You can simply just have a purpose and a statement, or even just a statement that's really clear about, what is the boundary or what is the rule. One component of upholding your policies as well is making sure that you have policy reviews. What I do not mean is that you review every single policy every single year. It's very exhausting. We learned that our old policies, when we updated them, were from 2004, and then we didn't touch them until 2016. We did it all at once, and it took a whole year, and it was a huge pain in the butt, speaking honestly. So now we try to review one or two every year or two as they're relevant. When possible, get volunteers involved in upholding or changing policies, or even making new ones. Like maybe you leave today and decide you want to make new ones, because volunteers know what works and what don't, or what doesn't. And then you also want to consider how laws change over time, and you want to stay compliant. So just like I said with the police check rules changing, or a few years ago when the accessibility rules changed about who gets the training. I'm just going to pop into the questions in the chat really quickly before I continue. So Rachel asked, what is your suggestion on these policies? Should each one be in writing specifically to the volunteer, or can they be a general checklist item during orientation that you've discussed it and a volunteer is aware of the expectations? I recommend a bit of both. Our volunteer handbook, someone shared most policies can be incorporated into the handbook. We have, I think we have 3 policies in the handbook. We have dismissal, we have workplace violence and harassment prevention, and there's one other that's escaping my mind. And the reason for that is that those are the essential policies that we need volunteers to know, not just going over an orientation, but proving that they've read it, they sign off that they've read it, not that that's binding. And then some of our other policies, all of them are on our website. But in a lot of cases, yes, it can just be a statement. You can say, this is our process for screening, and that's the policy, just as an example. But I would recommend, again, that you have a process in place for what's the most essential and should be seen should be seen by everyone. Charmaine, thank you so much. Volunteer Toronto has a sample handbook on the website. It's the best, stolen many items over the year. I will add that to the folder so everyone can find it as well. So you can use that too. And another question, this is a question I got directly to me, but I do want to address it quickly with everyone. Someone shared that they recently read that a volunteer cannot legally volunteer more than 4 days a week. This may have been an American site. Do you know if that applies here? I don't believe it applies here. I've never heard or seen anything of that. Just from a general, like, not torturing people thing, you don't want to make volunteers volunteer like 12-hour days back to back to back. During the Pan Am Games, which is now amazingly 7 years ago, volunteers were scheduled to midnight after an 8-hour shift and then told to come at 4 a.m. the next day because it was quote unquote the next day. That was bad, but there's no law about it. So obviously they changed that once they realized their scheduling system was having problems. But again, I don't believe there's any legal limit on the amount of time a volunteer can or should volunteer. But from a best practice, a volunteer should not be doing the work of a paid employee. They should not be doing identical work. A volunteer is supporting the work of a paid employee and complementing it, but they shouldn't be doing the same thing. So it's not like an organization gets rid of a paid employee who is full-time and then brings in a new person for the same number of hours, the same work, but they're a volunteer. That should not be done. And that would be an issue with more so with the Canada Revenue Agency than anybody as well. So Charmaine shared, the only thing I've heard is mileage rates over a certain amount of kilometers, it affects income tax. Also not driving lengthy hours for safety. Definitely the second thing. There is a rule around the kilometers. I'm gonna look that up. I have heard it before, but I'm gonna double check what that is. As again, an expectation that unless someone's full-time role is around driving, there's rules around mileage coverage as well. All right, so now to quickly talk about the components of a good procedure. So I talked about those 5 pieces of policy could have. Procedures don't really follow a template. It's really just everything you need to enact the policy. It needs to be clearly linked. It needs to be connected as much as possible. And it can be anything from a form to a more detailed process. This should be accessible to everyone and as much as possible be respectful of what people are able to do or know. I will be the first to admit, as the co-author of Volunteer Toronto's policy update in 2016, we made our policies too long and our procedures too much. I'm saying that. You have this on recording right now. Some are really strong. Most of them we actually haven't had to change. But we look back on our procedures and realize, you know, some of these things didn't need 12 steps to enact, or our screening process didn't need to be this multiple templates and all these different things to make it come to life. So a good thing to remember as procedure is look at what you're already doing, what is working, keep doing that. But as another layer of that, ask your volunteers what's working as well. So one of the things that we see sometimes is that boundaries will pop up that actually keep the volunteers from being able to do their work successfully as well. One last thing I want to touch on as we reach the end of our time or approaching the end of our time is a code of conduct. Volunteers are not legally bound by any contract or agreement that you make them sign. As much as possible, humans will try to be bound by that, but there is no legal standing in Ontario, at least, or in Canada, that you can force a volunteer to sign a contract of commitment. You want them to commit. We have our volunteers sign an agreement saying that they understand what the expectations and commitment are, but we can't sue them for backing out on that, unlike a legally binding contract. So a code of conduct is obviously not a contract, but it is a great way to make sure that a volunteer is aligning with the expectations of the role. So we call ours a volunteer agreement, and it's quite brief, but really making sure that we're setting parameters for volunteers and volunteers are on the same page as us as well. So if you're developing or updating a code of conduct for whatever it might include, whether you're talking about behavior, whether you're talking about expectations, give volunteers input. So every time we update our agreement, we reach out to our volunteers and say, What do you think? What should change? What should not change? Unsurprisingly, we don't get a ton of feedback, but we still want that feedback if we get it. You want to, if possible, provide positive behavior examples instead of like, it's a way to address disruptive behavior and frame it in such a way where you're saying, actually, a good approach to a situation like this is X, Y, and Z. And that may not be in the code of conduct itself. Maybe it's in some training as well. But if there are really specific and unique things that do recur, you should mention it pretty upfront. Just say, volunteers must not do blank, whatever it might be. And a component of this is also reflecting volunteers' rights and responsibilities. So the Canadian Code for Volunteer Involvement includes these rights and responsibilities. Again, they're not a law, but it's a good thing to reference as well. Volunteers have the right to volunteer in an effective, safe, and supportive environment, and volunteers have the responsibility to act with respect for the mission, the stakeholders, the organization, and the community, and they will act responsibly and with integrity. It's really just saying that you and the volunteer are going to put in their best effort to do what they need to do and be successful. So another question came in from Alicia here. How do you mitigate the burden of ongoing training, refreshers, and policy sign-offs for volunteers? These are implemented by HR and our association. So we do sign off when volunteers join our organization, but that's basically it until a policy is revised. But our buy-in to that process is, again, asking the volunteers for their input and their participation in making the policy come to life. I am a huge policy nerd. Many of my volunteer roles have been working with organizations to revise policies. You might have people like me or other policy nerds or interested people amongst your volunteers, and that's another layer of buy-in as well. They might be interested in being part of a process to revise volunteer-specific policies, or even just provide their insight as well too. But if it's something that needs to happen really on a recurring basis, you need to assess why, and you need to assess the risk background for that. Yes, sometimes a risk threshold for certain roles are very, very high, and that sort of thing is needed. There's no denying that. But we hear from organizations sometimes, and I'm not putting anyone here on the spot, who say it doesn't matter what their volunteers do. They make every volunteer get a police check. They make every volunteer do this, 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 and this. And they have some volunteers who just simply do not need that level of sign off or not need that level of screening, especially for simple roles or micro roles as well. So we don't do annual sign-offs, but it is something that might be helpful for you, especially if you have ongoing long-running volunteers, which again we have, but it's not a super. Our longest-serving volunteers is only a few years, so we do have a lot of general turnover. So we find the concern is not as high, but it is something that might make sense for you as well. Charmaine shared, we use web app software for volunteer policy reviews, nice and simple. A good old book called By Definition, Policies for Volunteer Programs by Linda Graff. If you've seen it, it's a very jarring yellow cover. It was very helpful for Charmaine laughing. It is very jarring. This book is actually, it's quite old and it's still relatively up to date. It is written in the American context. You can find it on the Energize website, Energize Inc. Website. But what I will say around it is that, it's a good starting place for practice. The best practice is what your organization is already doing. What policies are already in place and how can volunteers be integrated? In some of the examples I've shared with you, I shared a Volunteer Toronto HR policy for staff and volunteers are in it. They follow the same process. Everything is the same, just to make it straightforward. Since we're running up to almost the end of our time, I'm going to ask for you to participate one more time in the chat to share a takeaway. So drop in the chat one of the following: either a policy that you want to write or revisit, a law that you want to take a deeper look at, or a legislation or policy topic you want to really dive into or explore further with your organization. So give that a moment to think it over, and then you can drop that in the chat, and then we will have a couple more minutes for questions. Very emphatic police checks with exclamation point, couple code of conduct, discipline and dismissal, dismissal again, a lot of code of conduct as well. More flattery from Charmaine, thank you. Somebody brought up a really good point around actually having a written down and formalized policy for resignation and role creation. Sometimes these are just rules that we know, but we don't have them written down. Take a better look at the police checks to see where they could be used, especially the free ones. New definitions, These are amazing. Thank you. Keep going on this. Keep writing your examples. And while you do, I just want to share one more thing with you as well, is about something called HR intervals. Anyone who's been in the sector for at least a few years might remember something called the HR Council. It unfortunately folded about 10 years ago, but it was a body of knowledge specifically around HR for nonprofits. It was one of the first things in the province that focused on HR needs specific to nonprofits. They had a lot of amazing examples of policies, and it has been reborn thanks to Ontario Nonprofit Network and a bunch of partners as HR intervals. This is a building platform. It just got started pretty recently. So they don't have a ton of policy examples yet, but they are going to be adding more of them into the future with more resources, more templates. And again, even though they're HR focused, even though they're more specific to the employee side, a lot of it is really great knowledge and applicability to our volunteer resource efforts as well. So I've seen a few other things that have popped up in here too, revisiting and looking at risk, looking at Health and Safety Act and AODA and how they relate. A great one around succession planning to stay ahead of, you know, the great resignation in everything that's going on as well. So we're down to the last 5 minutes. I do thank you for having me for this very whirlwind session. Like I said, you can catch me again at the PAVRO conference coming up in May. I'm the second session, but don't miss FISA's session on the first day because that's going to be amazing too. But you can see me there for a really in-depth look at Ontario Human Rights Code and volunteer engagement. We do have a couple of questions, so please feel free to drop your questions in the chat. And then also, of course, my email, my phone number's on screen. I will drop my email into the chat for you as well, but I believe it will be sent after too, so that there's possibility to reach me. Yeah, if you have a final question, now is a great opportunity before we all leave. Thank you.
Right, as we're waiting for final questions to come in, I just want to thank you so much, Sammy, for your time today. I just want to remind all of our members that we have another session coming up in June. So that's to be decided, the topic at this moment, but once we know what we're going to be doing, we'll send out some email communication to you about that. And we also will have recording and slides available to you as well, and there will be a survey with some for an opportunity for you to give some feedback about today's session as well. So we'll be sending that out to you in the next couple days or so keep an eye out for that.
Perfect. I'm not seeing anything else pop up, but I did just see Alex from PAVRO sharing that registration is about to launch for the conference, so that's great. And a few things that I mentioned from today, take a look at that folder, the link I sent. I'm going to share the link one more time, even though it'll be in the follow-up as well, because I'm going to add a few more things in there based on some stuff that came up today. And yeah, I hope to hear from you if you have questions, or otherwise see you around at all the different things coming up as well. And yeah, thank you for taking such good care of me, Michelle, and Florence getting this all set up. And have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Okay, thank you so much, Sammy. Really appreciate your time. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending. Everyone have a great day. Take care.